Today we're going to be talking about unlocking the value through the Dremio AI semantic layer. Welcome. A little bit about me. As Bali mentioned, I'm a solutions architect for Dremio, and what that means is that I help our customers use the product. I answer any technical questions, act as an advocate for our customers, like internally within Dremio, and from time to time I give training classes as well on Dremio. My background is in consulting, originally with PricewaterhouseCoopers and IBM, with a stint at Alteryx. If you're familiar with Alteryx, it's a on-prem and cloud analytics platform. Actually was mentioned in one of the sessions earlier today that one of our customers, PL Developments, is also using Alteryx. But my entire career, the entire time, I've been working with software development, SAP implementation methodologies, AI machine learning, and my degrees in quantitative business decision making, or what would nowadays a degree would be data science, but it was decision science at the time. So here's our agenda for today. First, we'll go over some basics of just what a semantic layer is, if you're not familiar, and then we'll get into more detail about how that applies to Dremio. And of course, this session is mainly about best practices. So we'll talk about the best practices for implementing a semantic layer in Dremio Enterprise Catalog, which is powered by Apache Polaris, also mentioned in other sessions today. After that, we'll go into some of the value that the semantic layer can bring to the table, focusing on things like governance and securing the virtual data sets within the Dremio ecosystem. And at the same time, providing users the ability to find data with what I would call like a just-in-time approach, right? So discovering accurate data at the right time with the maximum efficiency, and not having to send emails back and forth or Slack messages, that sort of thing. Trying not to waste any time, which has been the case in the past. And then finally, we'll talk briefly about how, the impact on agentic AI. For example, how Dremio can give agents the business context that they need to deliver high quality answers. Using the model built into Dremio, or bring your own model for that matter, using the pattern with the MCP server, for example. All right, so let's talk about semantic layer basics. Does anyone have a definition of a semantic layer? Anyone want to take a shot at what a semantic layer is? No takers? Okay. All right. So I put in a picture of the Brooklyn Bridge here because I like to think of the semantic layer as a bridge. It bridges that complex data sources and reporting tools with the business-friendly definitions, right? So this concept's been around for a long time. Primarily with enterprise data warehouses. Traditionally, data was loaded to a staging or landing area. Then it was cleansed and moved to kind of a base layer, which would be a semantic layer in quotes kind of thing. And then lastly, there would be a view layer on top of that, sometimes called a reporting layer or an application layer. And that would apply some business definitions, and expose data sets to application. It's been, this concept of a semantic layer has been around for about 30 years or so, and this, that links or bridges the say BI dashboards or the AI agents to the lakehouse itself. So again, it's that bridge. And Dremio's AI semantic layer, provides semantic search, for example, metadata, the data definitions, relationships that AI agents and analysts need to discover relevant tables, and even with our kind of wiki understanding business terms, for example, which is all available from semantic search, so agents can access those semantics as well. Now, how does this work in Dremio, right? So, Dremio is very flexible, but we do, and again, getting to the best practices here, we do recommend dividing that semantic layer into zones. And if you've used Dremio before, you'll see at the bottom these kind of purple icons is the kind of raw zone at the bottom there. And this is the physical layer, whether that's already in Iceberg tables ideally, or this could be tables and legacy data sources, Oracle, SQL Server, DB2, that sort of thing would be at that physical layer, or what we call the raw zone here. And then above that, we have the semantic zone, in which we will kind of further divide. You can see there's like 3 layers there. And sometimes we call this a layer cake of the semantic layer, right? So, we're kind of dividing it up into 3 or more separate layers there. So, and we'll get into why 3 and how it can be more a little bit later. But again, this the AI semantic layer within Dremio, uses the business nomenclature each step of the way. And we divide this up into that layer cake. We can have things like modifying data types and parsing JSON, and maybe CSV files, and at the same time, providing the governance and security all along the way, and we'll get into that too. So within Dremio, you can have the governance that you need at each layer in the layer cake. Okay, so let's kind of get into how Dremio, the kind of best practices and the pattern would actually work. So again, we normally have multiple layers, and this is very much analogous to standard modeling techniques in data warehousing, right? So the idea is to provide a kind of a low maintenance solution, again, still providing the governance that's needed for data access via Dremio. So how is this done? Well, we reuse building blocks, so everyone gets the same answer to the question, right? And this includes the AI agents that are, accessing the data, say via MCP server, or even within Dremio itself, the models within Dremio that would query this data. So, the way this would work in Dremio is, business users can have the ability with permission to create their own views within this multi-layer pattern. This is valuable because you can avoid having those business users going to the data team each time they need some new data set, right? So again, creating those building blocks where the business users can self-serve, and the development teams don't have to maintain as many data objects within within the system itself. And of course, again, talking about governance, this multi-layer pattern actually provides control along the way. So we kind of previously looked at this at bottom up. Now let's look kind of top down. So that very top layer there, we have the application layer, and this is the highest level, and this is the access layer for applications, reporting tools, and AI agents, right? So this is the top layer, that access layer that's part of the semantic zone. And these are typically going to be, aggregate data, and would have group by statements, for example. So that, that's going to be at that application layer. Now below that we have the business layer, and this is where those business rules come in. So this is where the business nomenclature, where you're going to standardize whatever the business would, if it's a customer 360 use case, for example, defining exactly what a customer is, or what a purchase amount would be. You have the ability to provide very clear definitions for those business terms within the business layer. And this is going to be shared business logic across all users. A lot of times this kind of business layer is put in a BI tool itself, right? So these rules are in Tableau, and then of course that causes a problem because then it's only in Tableau. So what if you want to switch to Power BI, or you want to use an AI agent, or you want to use a custom application? Of course, if those business rules are in Tableau, you're losing all that, and that's where we get into the situation where you can have different answers to the same question because different rules have been entered. Now with Dremio, of course, you can have all the shared business logic right in that business layer. And again, this is important so you can create it once and use it everywhere. Now, below that we have the staging layer, which is typically a one-to-one relationship to the tables in the physical layer, and this allows you to plug and play, so you can change data sources with the semantic layer within Dremio. If you have a staging layer with that one-to-one relationship, suppose that is in Oracle today, tomorrow it's actually in Iceberg tables, you just change the staging layer, and now the views that are using that same staging layer are going to automatically use the new data source, and users, applications, agents are none the wiser, right? You're just plugging and playing a different data source in there. And of course, the physical layer, or the kind of raw zone, is at the very bottom, and that's the tables. And these can be Iceberg tables. These could be, again, legacy data sources, a Snowflake table. All of that is going to be at the physical layer. All right, I'm going to just break and see if you have any questions about kind of the zones we talked about in the layers of the layer cake that's within the semantic layer. Anybody have any questions? No? Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and continue. All right. So, again, this session is talking about best practices. So let's get into how we would kind of architect this within Dremio. So, at the heart of this is the Dremio Enterprise Catalog powered by Polaris. So, heard about that multiple times during the other sessions today. And basically what we have is a top layer namespace, right? And you can divide this up, again, those layers we just talked about, into namespaces and folders. So a line of business, for example, can have its own namespace. And beneath that, you might have a folder structure for different revenue areas, let's say, or different departments or different projects. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Dremio is very flexible. We do, as best practice, suggest that you have at least 3 layers for the staging, the business, and the application that we just talked about. But you could have more, right? So you could have additional folders in there that are dividing up by project or line of business. And this becomes important when we talk about governance, which we're going to get to in a few minutes. All right. So why, what's the value in this, right? So, again, we'll talk about with governance, but the namespaces and folders can represent layers of permission. And, the data sets inherently inherit the sharing of the parent folder. And then allows some customization. So again, we'll get to that in just a moment. But importantly, users do not see in the UI things they don't have access to, whether that's a folder or a view, a namespace. If they don't have permission, they won't see it. So now some best practices about creating this architecture. Begin with the sources right at the bottom there and work your way upward. So once you've added in the tables that would be required for the above layers, then you can work your way upward. So and the idea is to prevent rework, right? Just like in software development where you have inheritance of objects, you can do the same thing with data, right? So with this, in using the semantic layer within Dremio. So at the staging layer, which is above that physical layer, this is where you would apply as best practice all the common transformations. So for example, if you have to cast values, right, to join on those values in a layer above, we'll get to that in the business layer, but if you're, in one data source you have a text string and another it's an integer, right, you might do that data transformation as part of the staging layer as best practice. Now, of course, you don't want to make any changes at the staging layer where it would need to be different at a layer above, right? These are all the changes that would apply throughout the model itself in the semantic layer. And then if there's any kind of cleansing that needs to happen, again, that would apply to all views that are above that in a layer above in the semantic layer. Common things we would see is like case statements. So you might have, in one data set, dollars would be USD, and then another data set might be dollars, another data set might be US or something like that. You can use some common transformations there, just an if statement, for example, or case statement to change those to those values to make it consistent across all the layers of in Dremio semantic layer, the layer cake, if you will. You can add in any kind of column aliasing, so if you want to standardize column names, again, data sources typically have different names for the same exact data. Here within that staging layer, you can, as best practice, standardize it. And likewise, if you have any calculated fields that would be needed across all data sets, you could add that to this layer as well. The important thing is that you want to maximize reuse, and if there is something that would not be reused, maybe it wouldn't belongs in the business layer. Staging would be for things that are used across all layers. Some rules of thumb, best practices in that staging areas. The staging area, you're not going to have any joins in this layer, right? This is, for those things that we've just talked about, you're not joining tables. That's going to come next. And there certainly are no group by statements. That's part of reporting when you're aggregating data and that sort of thing. So that's going to come a little later as well. But just to kind of reiterate some common tasks that are within staging, you're going to have the column aliasing, data type casting, data cleansing, and then calculated fields or derived columns would be in staging. All right, so now comes the business layer, right? This is where you are combining views from disparate data sources and adding any business rules. Again, some of those business rules that might be in Tableau now, you want it to be accessible from any tool, including an AI agent. You're going to add that to the business layer. And some things that you might see in here. So if, for example, as a business rule, data needs to be filtered in some way, you might add the filter to that to the business layer. Again, applying to everything above, like to all applications that would use, say again, in a customer 360, if you need to filter customers because there are unused customers, or there's a flag that indicates they're no longer a customer or something like that, you might filter them out at the business layer. So rules of thumb for the business layer, you should only access objects in the staging layer from business. You're not going to be accessing anything from the application layer, and you're not going to be accessing any physical data sources either, because remember, the staging layer should have a one-to-one relationship to all the tables that are physical tables. So some things that we do see is perhaps skipping this staging layer and just going right to the physical. The table level or where the physical source is. And that can cause problems because you're not going to be able to plug and play then, like we talked about earlier, as easily, because now it's actually going to the source when you want to have a staging layer in there that is a layer of abstraction for those data sources. So again, business layer accessing things from the staging layer. Business layer, again, rule of thumb, best practice is this is where you're going to put the joins. You're going to join if you have data from the data lake and Snowflake, or Snowflake and Oracle, right? This is where those joins are going to happen, typically in the business layer. Just like with the staging layer, there's going to be no group by, rule of thumb, no group by statements in this business layer. That's usually going to be in the application layer when you have dashboards or other applications that are accessing the data within Dremio. Those aggregations would come later in a layer above. And speaking of the layer above, the reporting and application layer, that is at the top, and this is specific for the applications and the agents that are accessing Dremio. So this is going to be where you have 15 different queries that are in Power BI, let's say. Then those they're going to access Dremio via this application layer. They're not going to go right to tables. They're not going to go to staging. They're going to have an access layer at the top, which is what we call the application layer. Some rules of thumb for the application layer. Again, the application layer is likely only going to access views in the business layer. Sometimes I have seen to the staging layer for dimension tables, for example, in some cases. Again, it's a rule of thumb. I would, all things being equal, it would be best to go to the business layer, have something in the business layer. But I have seen folks, go to staging in this in application as well. Just be careful with that, and of course, never. I would never want to see you going to a data source from that application layer. And again, like we talked about, group by clauses, right? The aggregations are going to be at this top layer. All right, so talked about best practices here for the architecture for the semantic layer. Any questions?
So maybe I can add one point.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's a great point that you made, that staging layer, you have to basically, do a one-on-one. But sometimes what happens is the physical table could have, say, 2,000 columns, right?
Oh, yeah.
But the Dremio dashboard that the use case is built for may only always query 100 columns, right? So this is a good area where you only create the view on those 100 columns. And sometimes the physical layer could have like 10 years of data, but the dashboard requirements could be only last 3 years of data. So that's a good place to just, get that filtered out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that. That's great. Now you do notice that there's some, there's a column here that indicates kind of who has access, right? You have data engineer access, and subject matter expert access and the application access. One other thing to think about, we're going to talk about in just a minute, but it is, semantic layer is used for governance as well. So you're going to provide access to the different layers as appropriate. And there's fine-grained control of that, but typically you would not see an AI agent or a BI dashboard have access to anything else besides the application layer. So that's why that's listed there, but we'll get into that in kind of a little more detail in a minute. And I do want to mention something, if you haven't seen this or not used it, this has actually been updated in Dremio. Data lineage, right? So I should mention that the layer cake that we're talking about, Dremio will maintain everything that you're doing within the semantic layer itself, or that layer cake within the semantic layer. So maintaining the lineage all the way from the data source to staging to business to application, and any subsequent steps that you might have in there as well. So all parents and children will be in this view. And again, this has been updated very recently within Dremio. That it is a lot easier to use and a lot prettier to look at and navigate. And there's actually options to show hide layers. If you notice in the upper right hand corner. Yeah, so any questions about, I did want to mention the data lineage. Anyone used the lineage before? Any comments, questions? No? Okay. All right, so I do want to also mention Dremio reflections, right? So we talked about, other sessions have mentioned reflections. This is a physically optimized materialization of data within Dremio reflections. And this is important because what we typically see, because the business users and the applications are using the business and reporting application layers there, this is where the reflections come in. Now, in the past, of course, folks would have to proactively or directly create reflections. Now, it's pretty simple. You can just click a button to say create an aggregate reflection on an application layer object, or you can click the button and create a raw reflection, which is all keeping that row fidelity for the entire data set that's represented by that view. You would have to go in and do that, but now reflections are autonomous. So Dremio itself is monitoring queries as folks are using the platform, and will create these raw reflections and aggregate reflections, and also destroy them or drop them. Because these layers are going to be the primary layers that folks use, those are the objects that Dremio is going to create those reflections on. So I did want to mention that. And because with a semantic layer within Dremio, it's kind of create it once and use it everywhere, right? Dremio is going to automatically, with the reflections, create those materializations as appropriate. So where it's being used everywhere, where it's being used most, is where that reflection's likely going to be created. So I did want to put up this slide to just talk about the autonomous reflections. Like I said, Dremio is going to monitor query patterns and create, remove reflections automatically. I won't go into all the steps here, but I did want to talk about value of this, right? So, this completely eliminates any kind of manual tuning that would typically be done within Dremio. This is a game changer for Dremio with these autonomous reflections, and it can, create those sub-second query response times. So during the keynote presentation, you could actually see the query performance increase just by flipping the switch to turn on those autonomous reflections. And this, of course, a value as well is that it reduces that compute cost, right? Because if you're not having to, let's say you have some JSON data, you're not having to parse that JSON data. Every time a query comes in, you have a reflection created on that that's materialized that in an optimized way, rather than having to spin compute in order to go parse that JSON. Dremio is going to have that at hand and going to reduce your compute cost appropriately. All right, so let's talk about. Oh, any questions about autonomous reflections or reflections in general? Okay. All right, so governance, right? So again, I mentioned this before. This is something that's part of the semantic layer, because this is where you can create and maintain fine-grained access control and robust security with every layer and every object within Dremio. So One thing I will mention is, Dremio's enterprise catalog is powered by Polaris, but Dremio does have fine-grained access control where open source Polaris does not. So in other words, having row-level filtering and column masking is part of Dremio. So if you're using the Dremio engine, you would get that ability where, if you're trying to use open source or other platforms for that matter, you might not have that. So best practices, some important notes I did want to mention about security is in order to be able to affect security and change, say, grants on a particular namespace, then you have to have the manage grants privilege as part of your role or your user in order to modify these. Now, also best practice is be accustomed of using the sys.privileges system table because those privileges are going to be available to you in that system table. So something, if you need to audit, for example, you can use that sys.privileges table in order to see that. Any questions? All right, so again, let's talk about best practices with regard to governance. So we saw the different layers, right, within down here, the reporting layer, semantic layer, staging layer here, as part of the semantic layer, or that layer cake that is the semantic layer. What we typically see is that, data engineers would have access to the staging layer, right? But those, the report developers, right, would not have access to that staging layer. So those folks that are more technical that need access to the physical layers and those at lower level, they would have, say, alter privilege on that staging layer, but not everyone needs to have that access, right? So, usually the subject matter experts and, data modelers, they might just have select privilege on that particular level, or maybe even less. But usually you do have the staging layer is protected. And really no one needs to see that. They don't need to know what the physical column name is or what the actual, if we're using Iceberg tables, what the actual table name is. Because we're using the business layer, of course, you might have applied a different name to that object and aggregated data or perhaps joined data from different disparate sources. And so they don't need to know where it's coming from, right? You just use, you have a business object with a business nomenclature, and so the folks that are report developers don't need to see any of that. It's abstracted away from them. So best practices here for those permissions. One thing I will mention about governance too, because this does become applicable to the semantic layer, is Dremio provides the ability, again, to, at every step of the way, everywhere in the hierarchy, you can provide different permissions. And this can become very complicated. And so some things, again, some notes, things that we run into with customers is, kind of the scenario that you see here. Because it is possible to say, to use a grant select on, for example, on a particular folder, and or a namespace for that matter, and now that is going to provide access to that namespace and anything that's added to that namespace. Maybe you don't want that. Maybe you just want access to existing views within that namespace. So then you can use, say, a grant select on all data sets in, so you have the ability to just grant on existing views and not everything that's in there now and coming, right? So some things that we run into with customers. And likewise, you can just grant on a particular table, right? So you can just say, or a particular view, and now they only have access to that view. They can't see the other folders that's within that namespace. They would see the folder that particular view is in and that view, right? So Dremio does provide, again, that flexibility to grant at every step of the hierarchy. And really the kind of rule of thumb or best practice here is be careful, right? Is to be very clear on what the grant statements that you want to grant as part of the semantic layer. All right, and so finally we're going to talk about kind of how, what is the impact on AI agents with regard to this. Well, so, and one thing we haven't really mentioned yet is the semantic search, right? So you can think of that as also part of this semantic layer, if you will, because it's going to become important for AI agents, right? So Dremio has the ability to, to generate data set definitions, SQL examples, data tags, even wiki entries. All of that is going to be useful as part of, say, an AI agent accessing Dremio, perhaps using an MCP server. And you can kind of lump that together with the AI semantic layer because the common semantics are going to be available via semantic search, and the semantic layer itself, which is adding the business semantics or the business nomenclature to the data objects. And really, the goal is to enable easy data discovery, and exploration for humans, for analysts, but also for those agents too. So Dremio has the semantic layer where you're adding in the business names and business rules and business objects, but also semantic search, which is part of that autonomous, we'll call it autonomous AI semantic layer with some of the things you saw in the keynote, for example. So being able to generate those wiki entries and even generate tags automatically using AI. And the goal and the result of all this is AI agents work best with Dremio. They work better because now that AI semantic layer is accessible through that, again, if you're using the MCP server kind of pattern, if you have Claude that is asking questions of the data, it's now going to be able to discover that as part of the semantic layer, just like a human would. Again, adding in the semantic search, but it's going to be able to use a tool like find table to find the table. And if you've exposed this agent to the application layer, now it's got a useful name, a useful business nomenclature that's part of that table. That AI agent's going to be smarter. It's going to work better with Dremio. Oh, and I should mention, Dremio, as you saw earlier today, has its own AI built in, so it will use this as well, right? So, but you can bring your own model if you want to use ChatGPT, you want to use Claude, you can do that. Use the MCP server, bring your own model. But of course, if someone's using the UI within Dremio, it would take advantage of all of this too, all the semantics that we've talked about during this session. All right. So